You won't believe how fast a normal afternoon turned into pure chaos because of one person who thought she owned the world. My wife had simply pulled into the gas station, the same one we had gone to hundreds of times before, to fill up our truck. It was hot outside, the sun was blazing, and she just wanted to get the chore over with so she could head home. But of course, that's when it happened, when the notorious HOA Karen decided it was her time to shine. You see, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed sheriff of our neighborhood, a woman who thought her HOA badge gave her the power of law enforcement. In reality, she was just a woman with too much time, too much attitude, and way too much desire to control other people's lives. If you parked your car even slightly off-center in your driveway, she would be there snapping photos. If your grass wasn't cut to exactly the height she thought was acceptable, you'd get a warning. She lived for it. But that day, she took her obsession outside of the neighborhood, and she targeted my wife, of all people, at a place that had nothing to do with the HOA at all, the public gas station near the highway. My wife had swiped her card, heard the familiar beep, and grabbed the nozzle to start fueling the truck when suddenly she heard footsteps storming across the pavement. She looked up and saw Karen marching toward her, chin high, finger wagging in the air like she was about to scold a child. My wife sighed because she already knew what was coming. Karen never approached anyone calmly. There was always drama in her voice, always fire in her eyes. And sure enough, she pointed at the gas pump and snapped, "What do you think you're doing?" My wife blinked at her, completely baffled. "I'm pumping gas," she said slowly, wondering what on earth Karen was talking about. Karen scoffed and said, "Not here, you're not. This pump belongs to our HOA community. You can't just use it without approval." My wife nearly laughed out loud because it was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. This was a public station, owned by a company, right off the main road. Hundreds of people came through every single day. And here was Karen, claiming the pump belonged to the HOA. My wife tried to stay calm. "Karen, this is a gas station. Anyone can get gas here. It doesn't belong to the HOA." But Karen wasn't listening. She puffed up her chest and declared, "Don't lie to me. I've been watching you people for weeks. I know your tricks. You think you can just swipe fake cards and steal fuel? Not on my watch." She pulled out her phone and right there, in broad daylight, with other people staring, she dialed 911. My wife froze in disbelief as Karen dramatically shouted into the phone, "Yes, I need police immediately. There's a woman here stealing gas, right now. She's committing theft at the pump." People around stopped what they were doing. A man filling his sedan a few pumps over lowered his sunglasses and whispered, "Is this lady serious?" Another woman getting gas shook her head, muttering, "Somebody needs a hobby." My wife felt her cheeks burn, not from guilt but from the embarrassment of being accused of something so stupid. She held up her card and said, "Karen, I literally paid for this. The receipt is printing right now." But Karen ignored her completely, talking even louder into the phone like she was narrating a crime scene. "She's pretending to pay, but I know it's fake. She's robbing our HOA station blind." By now, my wife's frustration was boiling over. She grabbed the receipt as it printed from the pump and held it up in front of Karen's face. "Here. Look. Paid in full. On my card." But Karen didn't even glance at it. She just waved her hand dismissively and hissed, "Fake. Totally fake. You probably printed that on your home computer. I've seen people do it. Don't think you can fool me." My wife was stunned. It didn't matter what proof she gave, Karen had already convinced herself she was the hero of some made-up crime drama. And then, as if on cue, Karen shouted into her phone again, "The thief is threatening me with a fake receipt. Hurry, officers, I'm in danger." At that point, everyone nearby was watching. A couple of teenagers at the convenience store door had their phones out, clearly recording. An older man sitting in his truck was shaking his head in disbelief. The whole scene was starting to feel unreal, like a bad sitcom playing out in real life. My wife could have just walked away, but she refused to be bullied. She stood tall and said, "You know what, Karen? Call whoever you want. I've got nothing to hide." And that's exactly when she called me. Her voice was steady but annoyed as she explained what was happening. "You won't believe this," she said. "Karen's here at the gas station accusing me of stealing fuel. She called the cops." For a moment, I thought she was joking. I literally laughed because it sounded so absurd. But then I heard Karen's voice screeching in the background, and I knew it was real. I told her I was on my way. In the meantime, Karen kept circling the truck like a vulture, arms crossed, muttering under her breath about how criminals like this ruin communities. She even started telling random strangers, "Don't look at her receipt, it's fake. She's stealing from all of us." My wife just leaned against the truck, arms folded, holding the real receipt in her hand, waiting for the circus to end. The most insane part was that Karen wasn't embarrassed at all. She was proud. She actually believed she was doing the community some great service by harassing an innocent woman at the pump. And the look on her face? Smug. Like she was waiting for the police to roll up, arrest my wife, and give her the glory she thought she deserved. But little did she know, the receipt my wife held in her hand was about to make her look like the biggest fool in town. By the time I pulled into the gas station, the scene already looked like something out of a reality show. 2 police cars were parked near the pumps, lights flashing but sirens off, and a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered to watch. My wife stood calmly next to our truck, arms folded, holding the little piece of paper that was about to change everything, the printed receipt. Meanwhile, Karen was pacing back and forth like a prosecutor about to deliver the trial of the century. She pointed at my wife, then at the pump, then at the officers, her voice raised high enough that everyone in the area could hear her accusations. "That's her. That's the thief I told you about. She's using fake cards, stealing gas, and now she's waving around a phony receipt." The officers, both young but professional looking, tried to keep straight faces as they listened, but even from my car I could see them struggling not to roll their eyes. I walked over quickly, not to escalate but to support my wife. She gave me a relieved smile when she saw me, but I could tell she was still frustrated by the whole ordeal. One of the officers turned to her politely and asked, "Ma'am, can we see proof of purchase?" Without hesitation, my wife handed him the printed receipt. He glanced down at it, scanned the numbers, checked the time stamp, and then looked back up at her with an expression that was almost comical, because in that moment, the absurdity of what he was dealing with hit him full force. He stifled a laugh, then showed the receipt to his partner. The second officer glanced at it, then burst out laughing so hard he had to take a step back. The crowd nearby chuckled too, clearly catching on that Karen had made herself look like a complete fool. Karen, however, wasn't about to give up her fantasy. She marched over, arms flailing, and shrieked, "Don't you dare fall for that. That receipt is fake. I've seen people on YouTube print those at home. Criminals do it all the time. She's lying." The first officer raised an eyebrow and said calmly, "Ma'am, this receipt was generated directly from this pump, and it matches the transaction log. It's valid." But Karen wouldn't hear it. "No, no, no. You don't understand, this is HOA property. This whole gas station is under our jurisdiction. She can't just come here and steal from us." The officer blinked at her in confusion, then said bluntly, "This is a Shell station, ma'am. It's not HOA property. It's public. Anyone can buy gas here." The people around started laughing openly now. A teenager holding his phone whispered loudly to his friend, "She thinks she owns the gas station." Another man yelled, "Lady, it's not your pump." But Karen was so wrapped up in her own version of reality that she ignored them all. She jabbed her finger at my wife and declared, "I don't care what you say, she's guilty. Arrest her." That's when one of the officers finally lost his composure. He actually chuckled and said, "Ma'am, we don't arrest people for buying gas legally." His partner, still holding the receipt, added, "If anything, you're the one causing a disturbance here. Filing a false 911 call is serious business." The word seemed to finally hit Karen, but instead of backing down, she got louder. "You think I'm afraid of you? I'm the HOA president. I know the law. I don't have to show you anything." She crossed her arms defiantly, acting like she had real power. The first officer sighed and said, "Actually, you do need to show ID. You called in an emergency that turned out to be false. That's misuse of 911, and we need your information for the report." Karen froze for a moment, caught off guard. She glanced at the crowd, suddenly realizing she wasn't the hero she thought she was. People weren't applauding her bravery, they were laughing at her. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of her meltdown. My wife, meanwhile, leaned against the truck with the calmness of someone who knew the truth was on her side, holding back a smirk as Karen's perfect little plan unraveled. Karen tried to pivot, lowering her voice and muttering, "I was just trying to protect our community. I thought she was stealing. I was doing my duty." But the officer wasn't buying it. He held up the receipt and said, "Your community has nothing to do with this. This receipt proves she paid. You wasted our time." Karen's face turned beet red. She tried again, weaker this time, "Well, maybe the receipt is real, but I had no way of knowing that. I had to act." The second officer tilted his head and said, "So your first instinct was to accuse her of theft and call 911? Not ask her? Not check with the station? Just call in a crime that didn't happen?" By now, even the gas station clerk had come outside, standing near the door with his arms folded, watching the mess play out. He shouted across the lot, "She paid. I can see it on my screen in here. Transaction cleared. Stop bothering my customers." That only fueled the crowd's laughter even more. Karen turned around and saw dozens of eyes on her, phones recording from every angle. Her swagger had completely deflated, but she still tried to salvage some dignity. "Fine," she huffed. "But next time, don't say I didn't warn you when people start stealing gas from our community." The officers exchanged looks that said everything. They were dealing with someone completely detached from reality. One of them told her firmly, "This is your final warning. If you ever call 911 for something this petty again, you'll be charged for filing a false report. Do you understand?" Karen muttered something under her breath but nodded. She was boxed in. The hero act had blown up in her face, and the more she argued, the worse it got for her. I stood next to my wife, squeezing her shoulder, proud of how she'd handled the whole thing without losing her cool. She handed the officer her ID just to show cooperation, and he chuckled as he handed it back, saying, "Honestly, we should frame this receipt, it's the funniest evidence we've seen in weeks." The tension eased, the crowd laughed again, and Karen finally realized she had lost. She stomped back to her car, slammed the door, and sped out of the lot, tires screeching. As the flashing lights from the squad cars reflected off the pavement, one of the officers turned to us and said with a smile, "Well, you two enjoy the rest of your evening. Sorry for the trouble. I think your neighbor just earned herself a new reputation." And he was right. From that moment on, everyone in town who saw that video, everyone who had been there at the station, would remember Karen not as the powerful HOA president she pretended to be, but as the woman who tried to call the cops on a gas receipt and ended up the punchline of her own story. The officers, now done laughing at the absurdity of the whole situation, turned their attention back to Karen, who was still fuming but clearly rattled by how quickly the crowd had turned against her. One of the cops took a step closer and said in a firm, no-nonsense tone, "Ma'am, you need to understand the seriousness of what you just did. Calling 911 for something that isn't a crime isn't just wasting our time, it's dangerous. While we were out here responding to this, someone else in real danger might not have gotten help as quickly. Karen tried to hold her ground, but her voice cracked when she answered, I was protecting my neighborhood. I thought she was stealing, and if I didn't step in, who would? That's my responsibility as HOA president. The officer shook his head and replied, no, your responsibility as a citizen is to use 911 only for real emergencies, not your personal grudges. You're not law enforcement, and you don't own this gas station. This has nothing to do with your HOA. The crowd was still hanging around, watching with amusement, phones raised to capture every word. A couple of people even started chanting softly, show your ID, like they were egging on a boxing match. My wife and I didn't even have to say a word, we just stood there, letting Karen dig her own hole deeper and deeper. She puffed up again, trying to salvage some of her dignity, and barked, I don't have to show you anything. I know my rights. I know the law. That made the second officer chuckle under his breath, and he said, actually, you're wrong. When you call 911, you create a report. That means we need your identification to document what happened. If you refuse, you're obstructing us. Karen's confidence wavered. For the first time, I could see her hesitation, the crack in her armor. She glanced around at the people recording her, clearly aware that every second of her stubbornness was being preserved forever on someone's phone. She started to panic, realizing that if she refused to cooperate, she might actually be cuffed and taken away. She stammered, well, I didn't mean for it to go this far. The first officer crossed his arms and said, it already has. We're giving you a chance to do the right thing. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Finally, with shaking hands, Karen dug into her oversized purse, pulled out her wallet, and slapped her ID into the officer's hand with a huff. There. Happy now? The officer glanced at it, wrote down her information, and handed it back. He didn't even hide his smirk as he said, yes, thank you, Mrs. HOA President. The crowd snickered, and Karen's face turned bright red. My wife leaned close to me and whispered, she's never living this down, and I couldn't help but agree. But Karen still wasn't finished embarrassing herself. After a few moments of silence, she suddenly pointed at me and barked, and who's he? Why is he even here? He wasn't at the pump. Maybe he's part of the scam too. The officer looked at her like she had just sprouted two heads. He's her husband, he said flatly. And he hasn't done anything wrong. You're just making this worse for yourself. The crowd burst into laughter again, someone even shouting, Karen, give it up already. But Karen just couldn't stop. She started rambling about how our family was always causing trouble in the neighborhood, how she'd seen us breaking HOA rules and challenging her authority. She was throwing everything she had at the wall, desperate to justify her behavior. That's when the officer raised his hand to stop her. Ma'am, none of that has anything to do with this. We're not here to enforce HOA rules. We're here because you claimed a crime was happening. We investigated, and it wasn't. End of story. He paused for a moment, then added, if you keep making accusations without evidence, you're the one who's going to end up in legal trouble, not them. His words hit like a hammer. For the first time, Karen went quiet. She looked around at the people laughing, the phones recording, the clerk from the station glaring at her, and she realized she was completely cornered. There was no saving face. The receipt my wife held in her hand had destroyed every ounce of credibility she thought she had. And yet, even in that moment, Karen couldn't admit she was wrong. Instead, she muttered under her breath, "You're all going to regret ignoring me. I'm just trying to protect this community." The officer rolled his eyes, clearly done with her nonsense, and said, "Ma'am, the only person in danger here is you if you don't stop. Consider this your last warning." The tension broke again when someone in the crowd shouted, "Receipt, 1, Karen, 0, and laughter rippled through the gas station. My wife, finally letting herself smile, held the receipt up like a trophy, and the crowd actually cheered. Karen's humiliation was complete. She turned on her heel, stomped toward her car, and fumbled with her keys in her rush to escape. Before she got in, she turned back one last time, glaring at us with pure hatred, but all she managed to do was make herself look even more ridiculous. With a slam of her car door and a screech of tires, she was gone. The officers relaxed, chuckling among themselves, and one of them said, "Well, that's a first for me. Never thought a gas receipt would be courtroom-level evidence." The other nodded and added, "Honestly, if she calls us again for something like this, we're not going to be laughing. She'll be in cuffs." They handed the receipt back to my wife, who carefully tucked it into her wallet like it was the most valuable document she'd ever owned. In a way, it was proof that sometimes the simplest piece of paper can shut down the loudest bully. As the crowd slowly dispersed, people kept giving us thumbs up, pats on the back, even a couple of fist bumps. One teenager called out, "I'm putting this on TikTok. You guys are going viral." My wife and I laughed, shaking our heads, but we knew he wasn't wrong. By the end of the night, half the town would know about the gas station incident, and Karen's name would be forever attached to it. On the drive home, my wife leaned back in her seat and let out a long sigh. "I can't believe she actually did that," she said. I shook my head and replied, "With Karen, I can believe anything. But at least now everyone sees who she really is." And she was right. After that day, Karen's reign of terror as HOA president would never be the same. After Karen sped off like a storm cloud, the entire atmosphere at the gas station shifted. What had been tense and awkward turned into almost a block party vibe, with strangers laughing, joking, and talking about what they had just witnessed. A couple of people stuck around to shake my wife's hand, telling her, "Good job keeping calm," while others chuckled, still shaking their heads at the absurdity of the whole situation. One man even said, "I've lived in this town 20 years and I've never seen anything that ridiculous. That lady's off her rocker." The officers lingered a bit longer, double-checking details for their report. One of them looked at my wife and said, "You handled yourself better than most people would have." Honestly, some folks would have lost their cool and started yelling back, but you kept it professional. That's what made her look even more foolish. My wife smiled politely, still holding the infamous receipt like it was a winning lottery ticket. Once everything wrapped up and we climbed back into our truck, I thought that was the end of it. But as we drove back into our neighborhood, it became crystal clear that the story had already started spreading. Just a few blocks in, we saw neighbors standing in their yards, waving us down and calling out, "We heard what happened at the gas station." Someone shouted, "Did Karen really call 911 over a receipt?" Word traveled fast, and in a community where everyone knew everyone, Karen's downfall was instant gossip. By the time we pulled into our driveway, my phone had already buzzed with 3 text messages and a link to a video someone uploaded online. Sure enough, one of those teenagers from the gas station had posted the whole encounter, and within an hour it had thousands of views. The caption read, "HOA lady calls cops over gas receipt, cops can't stop laughing." Sitting on the couch later that evening, my wife scrolled through the comments, shaking her head in disbelief. People were ruthless. Comment after comment mocked Karen, calling her gas station sheriff, pump police, and receipt Karen. Memes were already being made. One had a picture of a gas pump with the caption, "Property of HOA." Another showed a receipt with the words, "The most powerful document in town." We laughed until tears rolled down our cheeks, not because we wanted to be cruel, but because the whole thing was so ridiculous it was impossible not to. But not everyone was just laughing. Some people in the neighborhood started speaking up. Folks who had been bullied by Karen in the past, people who had stayed quiet to avoid her wrath, suddenly found the courage to share their own stories. One neighbor came by the next morning and said, "She fined me once because my trash can lid was crooked." Crooked. I paid it just to get her off my back, but now I see she's just a bully. Another neighbor added, "She tried to tell my teenage son he wasn't allowed to park his car in our driveway because it looked messy. She had no authority, but she acted like she did." The more we listened, the clearer it became. Karen had spent years controlling people with intimidation and threats, and the gas station incident had finally exposed her for what she really was. A couple of days later, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. Apparently, Karen had tried to spin the story in her favor, claiming she was the victim of online bullying, and that people were spreading lies about her. But the problem was, the video was undeniable. Everyone had seen her pointing, screaming, and calling 911 over something so petty. Her credibility was gone. At the meeting, several neighbors openly challenged her, saying they didn't feel safe with someone like her representing the community. One man even stood up and said, "You embarrassed all of us. You made our neighborhood a laughingstock." Karen tried to argue, but every time she opened her mouth, someone else pointed out her behavior at the gas station. It was checkmate. She couldn't escape the truth because it was recorded from multiple angles and shared across the internet. Eventually, the board voted to remove her as president. She stormed out of that meeting just like she had stormed out of the gas station, slamming doors and muttering about how she would sue everyone, but her power was gone. Without the title, without the false sense of authority, she was just another neighbor. And suddenly, without her position, people stopped being afraid of her. They mowed their lawns the way they wanted, parked their cars where it was convenient, and decorated their homes without worrying about nasty letters showing up in their mailboxes. It was like the neighborhood took a deep breath of fresh air for the first time in years. As for my wife and me, we became somewhat local legends. People jokingly called us the receipt family. One neighbor even brought over a picture frame and said, "You should put that receipt in here, it deserves a place of honor." We laughed, but you better believe we did exactly that. It still sits in our home office, a reminder of the day a little piece of paper shut down the biggest bully on the block. Even weeks later, people would stop us while walking the dog or getting groceries, asking about the story. Some would laugh and say, "Did that really happen?" Others would shake their heads and mutter, "Unbelievable." She always thought she was untouchable. And every single time, my wife would smile, pull out her phone, and show them the video clip, just to watch their jaws drop. It never got old. The officers who had been there that day even became friends of ours. We saw them around town a few times, and they always brought it up with a grin. One of them once joked, "I still tell rookies about you too, the case of the legendary receipt." Best laugh I've ever had on the job. That kind of sealed the deal. What started as a humiliating scene turned into a running joke that brought the community together and left Karen completely stripped of her false power. In the end, the whole experience taught us something important. Sometimes you don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you don't have to shout louder than the bully. All it takes is the truth, a little patience, and, in our case, one tiny receipt that carried more weight than all of Karen's yelling combined. That simple slip of paper ended years of harassment and gave an entire neighborhood the courage to stand up against someone who thought she could control everything. So if you've ever dealt with your own version of a Karen, someone who believes rules apply to everyone except them, someone who invents power they don't have, remember this story. Because sometimes the smallest piece of proof can bring down the biggest ego. And for us, that little receipt wasn't just proof of payment, it was proof that common sense and truth always win in the end.